Environmental challenges are hard. Emotionally, mentally, physically, disasters take an immense toll. Even just understanding that the places we live and love change over time, it takes a toll. On today's program, we're talking through this a bit, but we're doing it from a different perspective. We're thinking about how places change and the way that communities understand that change, especially through their memories and memorials. How different places are being grieved, understood, and the ways that communities come together to create spaces to understand the shifts we experience alongside environmental change. I'm Weston Twardowski, the Associate Director of Rice's Center for Environmental Studies and Associate Director of Eco Studio in Rice's Sustainability Institute, and you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Jennifer Ladino, professor of English at the University of Idaho, where she thinks about memory and place, and in particular, how changing environments are being communicated and understood by people as they shift. Alongside her is a geographer, Dr. Nick Koenig, who recently taught a course with her, and the two are here to chat all about the ways that we think about changing place. Alongside me is Dr. Chaney Hill, who is a recent graduate of Rice's English department and thinks specifically about the Western United States and how we understand that culturally. Dr. Ladino, Dr. Koenig, welcome to the program.
Okay. So I just wanted to open up the conversation with a question about how you think memory shapes our relationship to place, especially in regions that are particularly vulnerable to climate disasters. Weston and I are located in Houston, which is vulnerable to flooding and other similar kind of issues. And then y'all
Oh,
are
there's
up
a
kind of
whole range
closer.
of things we're vulnerable to here, but you
Many,
have your
many.
own you have your own list, and basically everyone does now. So yeah, I'd take it away. Give us I think as we start thinking through these things, I think that's a good place to think about how we can process.
Yeah, that's a great place to start, Chaney. And thanks so much to you two for having us here today. Nick and I are just thrilled to be part of this conversation. And we actually are just finishing up a course on the geohumanities that we've called Mapping a Sense of Place. And so we've been thinking a lot about what makes a place, how we know a place when we see and feel and experience it. And I think memory is a huge part of what makes a place, what makes it meaningful. Places are passed down through storytelling, right? Which is a huge part of how we get to know where we are, how we know who lives there, how we feel about where we live. And I think you can't really talk about a place without talking to some degree about memory.
Yeah, also thanks for having us. I think this is something, it's been really fun. What Professor Ladino is kind of talking about. Teaching this class with her has been super interesting because I come from a geographic discipline and she comes from an English studies and memorial studies discipline. So having us like in conversation with one another disciplinarity wise has been super fascinating. So we've thought a lot about more of like how climate change disrupts some of the memory studies or kind of the discipline that Ladino comes from. And a lot of my work originally was in the Appalachian Mountains. And as we saw with the hurricanes that have been ripping up the backbone of the Appalachian Mountains, a lot of those communities were considered like climate safe havens almost. And I think a lot of folks now are seeing that there's no place that can keep you safe from climate change. And we all, like you were saying, have this kind of list of things that could impact us, and that list is growing, especially when you layer on top of different levels of precarity that people are kind of facing. And more than in our northern Idaho context, it's not flooding really ever. We do have maybe the stream in town gets a bit high, but it's not life-threatening for people for the most part. But for us, it's fire, of course. Fire is such a big impact in our region, and drought And when we look at some of the reports that the Coeur d'Alene tribe up in northern Idaho has put out on the life ways in which northern Idaho is going to be radically changed if there isn't pretty large systemic level changes to um, our greenhouse gas emissions, that we're going to see temperatures that are completely unlivable. So it's something that our class was thinking a lot about, was how these climatic changes are going to be changing our place actively up here.
I think that's, I mean, that's fascinating, but I think that's like right on the money in terms of, I'm thinking of Vermont, which for years was heralded as this kind of climate escape, this place that folks were going to, and I mean, about 5 years ago, you were seeing that, the mayor of Vermont was saying 10% of our population, or not Vermont, a small town in Vermont, but is saying 10% of our population now is climate refugees, which I never would have thought a decade ago. And then to watch the floods that came through and just, streets be overturned, and watching and hearing folks on the ground just responding with, I came here to escape this. I came here to get away. And that idea that there really are no climate havens, I think is something the last 3 or 4 years is really something we're starting to grapple with. And that feels different in this new way. Yeah, Jen, you want to jump in?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think most recently Asheville, right? Asheville, North Carolina was in the news for being one of those places that was sort of revealed as not necessarily the safe haven that people had thought it was going to be after Hurricane Helene. And interesting for this conversation, I was just seeing that an artist, I'll have to look up his name, is taking debris from the storm and turning it into a climate change memorial.
I would be really interested to know what that piece was. It reminds me, I had a student in the environmental justice course that I taught last fall who, for her final project, she's also like an artist. So she created it was like a drawing and a painting, and half of it was she's from Asheville, from that region. So half of it was a painting of the bridge as she remembered it, and then the other half was like a sketch drawing of what it is today after everything that happened, because that was very fresh at that time. And then she was so it was like climate art, eco art, and she had a little like artist statement with it. It was really, really cool, really impactful.
Yeah, I found the name of the artist I was thinking of. It's Tony Bales, who's creating memorials from fallen trees in the aftermath of Helene. So super interesting. This is something that Nick and I have thought a little bit about with our students in terms of creative cartographies, counter cartographies, ways of, mapping relationships to the world and to change, especially climate change, that can be both eye-opening, but also can kind of run counter to some of the dominant systems that are keeping things that are fueling the crisis, essentially.
Oh, and I think
Yeah,
that, oh, sorry, go ahead, Nick.
I was just going to quickly say I've also seen there's artists that I'll show you all that can see, but I do tree ring art. So basically you take a tree ring cross section or a tree body, you sand it flat and then you burn it. And because of the different densities between the cells, it creates this layers that can make for really beautiful tree prints. But I've seen people in Asheville take some of the fallen trees in North Carolina more broadly and make tree ring prints of that. And it literally shows the ecological and climatic change bodily from the trees previous to the hurricane, and then encapsulates that visually pretty astonishingly. And I think that that's like a really great way to kind of bear witness to the changes that those regions are experiencing in really um, just like awesome ways, and the awesome at the very historical use of the word awesome, not the popular culture word of the awesome.
Yeah, as in awing. But I think this gets into a broader conversation that you'll probably want to jump into, Jen. But I mean, a natural way that we handle any kind of crisis, break moment, disaster is through memorializing, right? Is through understanding that memory. And we can play this game kind of for hours. I'm thinking of Galveston here close to Houston when Hurricane Allison came through a number of years ago. It knocked down a lot of trees, and people actually carved those stumps into various artworks all throughout essentially just wanting to hold on to some memory of these kind of great trees that had stood before. And we can find this in, I work on post-Katrina studies, like I can rattle off a whole chapter of memorials that I've written on. And so, I mean, this is common to humanity. Like the way that we understand is so much tied to our conceptions of memory. So I'm curious, Jen, if you want to talk some just about how, as the climate is changing, as these things are more frequent, as we're seeing different kinds of disasters that are, in some ways more catastrophic than we have really for centuries, do you see folks? Certainly, we're hearing plenty of examples of folks using memory to navigate this, but do you think there are strategies? Are there things you're seeing imparted? How are you seeing people understand the realities of a changing climate through monuments, memorials, or just broader ways that we understand our own memory of a place?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple different ways to answer that question. I think maybe I'll start by just thinking about the wider range of emotions that are becoming commonplace and that are becoming part of people's vocabulary for how we're feeling about these changes, right? And we, takes a variety of forms. There are people who are still very insulated from a lot of the devastating impacts of climate change, who have one set of emotions that are relatively privileged. And then there's other people who've been through actual disasters who might have a different set of emotions, right? But I think it's really interesting that in emotion studies, people used to talk about sort of hope and despair. And there was this understood kind of binary, like, this is how we tend to feel. Either we feel good or we feel bad. It was super simplistic. And that's when I got really interested in emotions about climate change, right? Because clearly our emotional lives are a lot more complex than that. And I think the more that we live through and in the climate crisis, the richer that suite becomes. And now you've got, like the APA talking about eco-anxiety, and that's a defined psycho-emotional feeling state that you can look up, you can diagnose. Therapists are talking about that. There's talk about ecological grief. There's talk about radical and critical hope. So you still get a little bit of the hope and despair binary in there, but then you get new words like solastalgia, which I think is a super interesting one. That was coined by the Australian philosopher Glenn Albrecht. And it's basically the kind of feeling of nostalgia, or kind of nostalgia means a longing to return home, but a kind of sense of felt loss in a place that you haven't left yet, but the environment itself is changing around you. And that's one of those things that it kind of relates to the first question we were talking about, what happens when a disaster comes through, right? You've got a kind of a before and an after. And so you've noticed a change and something's happening. And sometimes that's dramatic and spectacular. Other times it might be slow and you're not noticing it in as dramatic of terms, but the feeling state is similar, the sense of change over time, how you're registering that and feeling that in your body. And that can be really, of course, paralyzing and devastating on one hand, but it can also be diagnostic. It can raise awareness, especially when given shape in a kind of memorial form. So I'm really interested in solastalgia, traditional nostalgia, which is when you've left a place and you've come back and you're kind of either you're longing to return to that place or you feel a sense of loss. But solastalgia is neat because you haven't necessarily left and yet you're experiencing change sort of on the ground, often in your home. So those are a couple ways to start thinking about the emotions that are sort of changing and developing as we inhabit this world.
I'll just throw out there was an art exhibit here in Houston a few months back, entirely focused on solastalgia, and we did a whole episode on it. So for folks who are interested in digging in a little bit deeper, I would encourage you to go back into the podcast archives and give that a listen.
I definitely will be listening to that. Thank you.
And I'm thinking too, I think solastalgia is a really interesting concept as well. And I'm thinking about stuff that I've written about my own childhood home and the flooding that happened there and the before and the after of that kind of experience in living in this place. And I'm just wondering if there are other, like, what type of stories do these places hold? The places where people are perhaps experiencing some form of solastalgia, and like, what stories have you heard? Can y'all bring in any kind of examples? And then on the flip side, Nick talked very briefly earlier about unequal effects of these these climate concerns. And so part of this question also is like, what stories are at risk of being erased in the retelling or the reiteration of these narratives?
Yeah, I'd love to share a project that I've had kind of the honor to help facilitate. So last semester, I developed a new class at the University of Idaho. It's like a gen ed climate science course called Climate Futures Catalyzing Change. And I taught it to a bunch of students in person, which was really fun. But then I also taught it to 19 incarcerated students at our university who are in the Orofino and Pocatello prisons. And it was just life-changing in so many ways to be able to teach folks who have really been put through the system. And at the final, we were able to, they wrote climate fiction short stories. And we just published a set of 12 of those this past month, basically. I don't know. Oh, yeah, here it is. I can pick up the book in itself. But the last third of the inaugural issue of their of the it's called Resilient Dimension. The last third of it is climate futures and in climate fiction. And to think about what you're saying, when we think about some of the most precarious folks in the US, specifically when it comes to climate change and the climate crisis, of course, I think a lot of folks' minds go to people who might be homebound or people who depend on electricity for medical devices or people who are experiencing varying degrees of homelessness. But I think a community that's often not at the top of that list initially is incarcerated communities. And Hurricane Milton really showed the kind of the precarity pretty immediately because there were thousands of incarcerated folks who were in counties that received evacuation notices, but they were told to stay put in the prisons and they just huddled in the center, apparently. That's what some of the reports were kind of being put out. But that's all to say, this process in some of the short stories, one of my students specifically does this really interesting move of writing this climate fiction short story into the future about everybody living in a dome and how they have no communication to the outside and they don't have access to nature. Or they don't even know what flowers are. But that's actually her lived reality every single day. So I think it does this really interesting soul nostalgia-esque move to like speak to people on the outside to really like recognize what you have access to now that can be that could change under the climate crisis or incarceration.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I'll just, when Texas has a very big prison system, and we're not all that far from the state penitentiary in Huntsville. And I think that during COVID, especially, there were, as elsewhere in the nation, there were a lot of issues with incarcerated people, in particular during the summer, because I think that Texas doesn't require. I could be wrong about this, and maybe we should check before we publish this on air, Weston, but I think that they don't require the prisons to be air conditioned, which in Texas summer, in Huntsville, no less, as humid as it is on the Gulf Coast, is just, I mean, unfathomable, to be honest. And that hasn't changed. And they have a pretty brutal prison system here in Texas as well.
Yeah, you're not wrong. That so a federal judge did declare that we have to not permit extreme heat within Texas prisons after several years of repeat summer events that kind of prompted that ruling. But there's still no requirement for air conditioning in any Texas prisons. So
Yeah, that I mean that reminds me there's this amazing project called Fight Toxic Prisons and I cannot encourage their website enough. They just track all of this kind of injustice that's actively going on climactically and otherwise in prisons. And in Idaho, for example, you don't really need, in northern Idaho especially, you don't need AC under pre-industrial levels, right, of climactic change. But a lot of people are on the cusp of getting air conditioning or have to get it now. Just during our summers, they're starting to breach into the levels of intense uncomfortability, which is like those places that are right on the edge, right, of AC. But when the prisons were built in northern Idaho, they didn't need the infrastructure for AC. So transforming those systems in itself takes a lot of resources and demands, and then goes into kind of the broader arguments around reform or abolition that might not be the focus of today, but they're, albeit, really fascinating conversations to be had.
Mhm. Yeah, it also, I mean, I lived in Idaho for 2 years for my master's at Boise State, and they had, the inversion would come through and the air quality would just be, down the drain. I remember there was one instance where my power went out for some reason, and I had to choose between like being very, very toasty in my little apartment or like opening the windows and then being like choked out by the smoke that was being trapped in the valley, right? And according to friends who lived there for a long time, it had been getting worse. And so so we've talked about the stories that are at risk of being erased, right? And there's many, many stories that are at risk of being erased. But I want to maybe, shift gears, and think about what a climate change memorial could look like at some of the sites, perhaps that we have been talking about. We come from very different regions in the US, all spread out. So yeah, let's think together. What are some of the ideas that we can come up with? What would they look like?
Yeah, I remember when I originally read this, I was like, my first thought was affordable housing. I was like, that's just like where my mind goes, right? I'm doing a lot of community organizing work and really trying to keep like an activist kind of lens when I come to the academy. I'm like, yeah, that's great. We could do memorials, but like, what if people could live in them, right? Because that's the biggest issue in Moscow, right? In a lot of regions in the US right now is affordable housing. Of course, in tandem with that is food insecurity, right? So maybe in that memorial, there's also access to gardening spaces as well. But I don't know. That's where like I was like initially thought is thinking about these memorials as sites for actual like usability for folks who face some of the most precarious situations under climatic change.
I guess, yeah, to add my sort of slightly activist bent to that question, and then I might backtrack a little bit and think more about traditional memorials and forms that they might take. But there was an interesting op-ed in the New York Times, I think last year, recommending a climate wall of shame. Basically, you know how walls of names are very popular memorial forms. This would be one that named and shamed the sort of climate criminals, people who are fueling the climate crisis right now and may not live long enough to see the worst impacts of the crisis. So I would love to see something like that take place. I think here in the US at the current moment, it's unlikely to occur. Um, but thinking back to sort of more traditional memorial forms and things, which are sort of being blown up right now, it's really exciting. It's a great time to be studying memorials and thinking about trends in memory studies because there are all sorts of cool new forms from, digital memorials to underwater sculptures to graffiti and murals and just all sorts of really innovative new formats beyond the traditional sort of obelisks and walls and things like that and statues, right? But I was listening to the Monument Labs podcast called Future Memory, and a photographer named Stuart Polly was talking about. He's a wildfire photographer and has been in various news features, but was posed a similar question. Dream big about climate change memorials. What would those look like? And he talked about an already existing memorial to firefighters who have died fighting fires in California, and talked about it as a wall of names. But what made it especially powerful was that it had blank space integrated into it to sort of anticipate and allow room for the people who are certainly going to be casualties in the future. Beyond the walls of names, though, I mean, for fire, I'd love to see the giant sequoia integrated in some kind of memorial, right? A lot of those trees have been lost, and typically those are historically fire resistant species, but because of the climate crisis, fires are burning with more intensity, more heat, and these trees are having a harder time resisting some of these big conflagrations. So, but on the other hand, like those are, I've used the phrase charismatic megaflora in publication. They inspire really strong feelings for people. They've got charisma. And so I feel like there's maybe a way to integrate the sequoia themselves into some kind of memorial to kind of help tell that story. So that's one idea that I have. I think trends in memory studies often these days are doing more to sort of involve the more than human environment in the memorial, right? In addition to the human visitors and users who interact with different memorial spaces.
Okay, sorry. Other than building a bunch of affordable housing, um, there's one of my classes, what we did was I posed to them what's at stake with global climate change, and they made quilt squares. So they like, I'll hold some of them up that you can see. And this is specifically inspired by the AIDS Memorial quilt. So I'm really excited at the next university I'll be at. I'm really hoping to expand on this project a good bit, and really just like thinking about um, the lost generation from the AIDS epidemic, but kind of thinking similarly around the AIDS Memorial quilt, but doing it a bit before maybe we lose so much. There's already been so much that is lost because of global climate change, and there will continue to be. But how can maybe we quilt something together and stitch something together to include all these varied forms of stories that people can bring, so that we can prevent loss into the future through this like deeply like these like quilt squares are like emotionally super grabbing for the viewer, and it's so tactile, and it's so like fun to see what students decide to quilt onto one of the squares. So it's like really cool to see that, and I'm hoping to expand on that some more for sure.
And the quilt's such a cool format, Nick, because a quilt can be taken on tour, as the AIDS quilt has been, right? And that's such a great way to get people to interact with climate change and to make it present in people's lives from all over the world potentially. So I love that you're doing that project. It's super cool.
Yeah, and I didn't think about it. Also, like one of the reasons that the AIDS Memorial quote was like so profound was it helped people grieve, right? It helped people like go through the process of making these quilt squares, either with the person that was actively dying or after they had passed. And I think like I've talked to people who had helped build or made some of the quilt squares, and just hearing those stories of grieving has helped them like understand the injustices that were going on behind the scenes, right? And I think that similarly, like going through the process of making these quilt squares can help people realize some of the sources of the what's actually going on in the climate crisis, right?
Mhm. Yeah, no, I mean, definitely. I have like a million and one thoughts. But I really want to invite Weston, to talk about the group in New Orleans, who does, I'm forgetting, the name of the organization, but the one that we went to whenever we were there for the, conference, who has the garden.
Hmm. Yeah. So you're thinking of, oh Lord, Jackie Summel's work, who's an
Yes.
artist who's
Yeah.
had pieces around the world, and Jackie in particular has been thinking about kind of how gardens can be a space for, particularly coming out of working with incarcerated folks, thinking about the role of gardening, to preserve and hold and also imagine alternative realities, which I think I might push back slightly on the activist read of what memorials and monuments are for, and maybe just for the hypothetical of it. But and while I know and respect artists who I think are actually doing projects pretty directly in line with what you're describing around, really thinking about how can a monument also do a real tangible thing that has positive impact, and I think there's value. As someone who studies catastrophes specifically, I think giving short shrift to the work of processing grief does a disservice. I think that's a really core value, as you were commenting on with the AIDS quilt. Like these are sites and spaces for people to process and heal and understand and communicate in ways that otherwise we really struggle with. And as to go back to what Jennifer was talking about earlier with, solastalgia, yeah, it's an interesting idea, but it also gets the very real feelings of climate grief that we talk about a lot, eco anxiety, all these kind of terms, and that there is something remarkably painful to being in a place that is, all places change, like change is a natural part of life, but that you feel is dissolving away from you into something unrecognizable. And I will say, having studied and worked with artists and thinkers and environmentalists in New Orleans for the better part of a decade now, there is a palpable sensation of being from a place that we all know is dying. Um, and that is immensely hard. That is really shockingly hard. And so I think making the space for processing of that, which folks have tried to do. There was an exhibit in 2014 in Paris called Anthropocene Monument, that Bruno Latour was involved in, along with a number of other scholars that really asked, what would imagining a monument to the Anthropocene look like? And it's a lot of things that I think we might expect. There were kind of like trash sculptures and different things that, talk to the different issues around the world. I think I tend to be, especially as a Gulf Southerner, someone who's really interested in the ways that that discrete communities respond to breakout moments. In some ways, to the AIDS quilt point, right? Like there was so definitive within the gay community in particular, just the recognition. There was no way that anyone who went through the AIDS crisis in the gay community was not touched by it for a decade. That I mean, the need to engage with that and really to process that moment is so clear. And so when I write about monuments in particular to Hurricane Katrina, or a concern with Hurricane Katrina that range from sites that mark where water lines were to give perspective on just how high that water got in different parts of the city, over to a discrete memorial to a woman who died, whose death site was the subject of photos and film around the country, and really trying to turn her from a deceased body into a whole human who deserves to be commemorated and remembered, which is a really personal act by a singular artist who has kept this as a mission to just preserve the memory of a human being. And I think there's immense value. I will say, oddly, maybe not oddly, maybe it makes total sense. I think in line with some of what Jennifer was pointing to, the monument or the memorial site that I found most impactful in looking at a wide array of memorials around the city is actually the University of New Orleans. And it's 4 trees that are completely twisted. And when you walk up to it, it says this is a memorial to Hurricane Katrina. These 4 trees were nearly uprooted and twisted out of their shape by the winds of the storm, and we have chosen to leave them to continue to grow. And that, I mean, it's impactful in that it's a plaque. I mean, it's there's no human design really in sculpting. It's just the acknowledgement and the act of preservation. And that I find incredibly, it was a site I found incredibly impactful. And partially because it's not something we could have created. It's something we could have sort of attempted to fabricate over decades through growing out a tree in a particular way, but it's not real. And the reality of that site. And I think I'm also very drawn actually to a lot of those memorials that are often these almost accidental spaces that someone chooses to not allow to be accidental, that they ascribe meaning to, that they say this is a site of importance, which is really what we're talking about, right? with memory and placemaking. That's human action. That is our will that we have decided, I will maintain the story of this place, of this moment, whether that's a singular person or a set of trees. And I find those acts of hyper local activism and intervention incredibly meaningful, both for survival and that kind of emotional role that these sites work on, but also to some extent the kind of pointing us in the direction of no, you don't get to forget, you don't get to escape this untethered. And I think a lot of the work of memorials around Katrina in particular are very connected to, this is not just a storm, this is not just an accident, this is conscious failure, this is disinvestment, this is a series of choices that resulted in the deaths of thousands of people, and we need to own that. And I think similarly, when we look to the broader scale of climate change, to Jennifer's point from that New York Times op-ed, not allowing this to be the accident of nature that we sometimes write, oh, it's just the weather, but recognizing, no, these are the consequences of choices we have and continue to make.
I have so many thoughts about all this. And I feel like we should have a whole conversation just about tree memorials because I can think of a handful of examples that I think um, build on what you're saying, Weston. But to kind of go back to this, I think false choice between activism and grieving, sometimes fueling grief is the kind of justice focused or activist approach when we're talking about climate change and memory. Because for some people, they haven't grieved it yet. They haven't really even become aware or sort of really felt it yet, right? So sometimes the point of a climate change memorial is to prompt a kind of anticipatory grief in the people that are encountering it or visiting it. And I have a great example, which actually comes from Rice University, from two anthropologists at Rice, Dominic Boyer and Samin Howe, maybe you know. And they were working on this documentary in Iceland, and they came up with this idea for, again, a very simple plaque, but a memorial to I'm going to probably mispronounce this, the Oakjukul Glacier. Is that close? I don't know. But the first Icelandic glacier to lose its status as a glacier and to be pronounced dead in 2014. And so they had this idea to write just a simple plaque that was a kind of letter to the future. And I'll read it to you because it's really, I think, poignant. This monument is to acknowledge that we know what is happening and what needs to be done. Only you know if we did it. And this kind of like direct address to the audience, this anticipation rather of an unknown future. The second person you address, it holds you accountable. It makes you sort of not only, have this shock of sort of grief, but maybe a little bit of shame, right? A little bit of a call to action in the present. And I find that, a very kind of activist in your face approach. It's not the same as a, memorial, a candlelight vigil, let's say, to victims of a tragedy or something like that. That's a very different kind of loss and grief that also needs to be processed and is really important. But I think with climate change, the task is sometimes a bit different.
I think it's dangerous to depoliticize any of those. Even that candlelight vigil often has the speakers, right, who are demanding accountability for whatever they're having the vigil for. Like
Yeah,
the idea that any
absolutely.
memorial site is depolitical is probably
Absolutely.
a bad read.
Agreed.
Mhm. Yeah, so we've thank you for all of that. It's all very interesting. Weston, I feel like I've been to New Orleans so many times, as you know, but I've never, I don't think, seen those trees. I'm going to visit my parents later this month and who live in New Orleans. And I'm gonna have to go to the university now to see these trees. So I'll send you a picture when I do.
You haven't
So
read
we've been
chapter 3 of my dissertation. That is just, I don't know how you missed that, Chaney.
Send it to me. Send it to me, Weston. You've read some of my
Oh,
stuff. I can
read it when it's in book form.
okay. I will do that for sure. Um, but we've been talking about all these different forms of different kinds and responses to climate change through memorials and monuments and the different ways that we can create forms of memory that can withstand the kinds of changes that climate change brings about. So we have direct address, we have kind of like mobile um, art productions, tactility, right? I'm thinking about the quilt. We have simple things as plaques, which just like acknowledge, right? So I'm also thinking about how, if we're creating forms of memory that can live with change, how do we enact, and like going off the script here a little bit, how do we enact that? All of us are educators, all of us interact with public audiences in some way, shape, or form. So how do we enact that in a classroom setting? That's where my mind goes because I'm like, all of these things are things I want to bring up in my class.
That's a great question and prompt. And I know Nick has done some really innovative pedagogy, and I've learned so much from teaching a class with them this spring. But yeah, I mean, I think in memory studies, there's been a lot of attention to, as I think I said before, ephemeral, mobile, kind of temporary memorial forms. There's been attention to things like holidays and ceremonies and performances and rituals as, memorials, things you can count as memorials. So I think as teachers, the more we can have a kind of embodied pedagogy in our classrooms and encourage, creativity in final projects and innovative forms, right? I've kind of moved away from assigning traditional literary analysis papers, at least in my climate change fiction classes, because I think it's really important for people to engage with it in different ways besides this traditional academic paper. But I bet Nick can speak more to some really cool forms that student work has taken.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for bringing up pedagogy and just like the teaching atmosphere, because that's where, like, I mean, as Ladino knows, that's where I find so much joy within the academy. Publishing is a different beast that I feel like I just do because we have to do, I think. But that's all to say, in the classroom, it's just so exciting to see where undergrad and grad student minds can travel if you just give them the push and the right prompts to do so. Um, and I think one of my students, she got a bunch of scrap fabrics from the architectural department and then sewed together a patchwork pair of pants that she wore to class, and then is writing a climate change fiction story of a person who lives in a heap of waste fabrics in the US and makes these pants. So I think like that is like really pushing the bounds of my mind so much when she's like, Nick, I want to make these pants and then write a short story about the pants with the pants in it. And I think about that, and then I also think about maybe in more of like a direct way, one of our students, he's a grad student, he took the project Queering the Map and took every single entry from Idaho, which was over 300, and is coding them for emotions and affects, and then kind of picking up on more subtle things. But that's all to say, like, I think it's been exciting to move away from the traditional essay format because students are just coming up with the most wild ideas on thinking about how we mobilize memory and mobilize place, and very like different kind of outputs that I would never be able to dream up. But they just bring these interests and hobbies into the classroom, and then they also, since they care so much about them, they often spend a bit more time than they might um, would have been on a traditional essay, which I'm okay with, of course, you know.
Mhm. Weston, did you have anything that you wanted to add to this?
Oh, I think I'm just going to copy Jen's great answer, which is, the more that we can engage around practical things, which is, I think the element we sometimes forget with theory, right? And they go hand in hand. You can't really practice without understanding the theory, but theory without practice gets us nowhere. So I think these two components going together and allowing students that opportunity to engage with both, and to connect, because as Nick pointed out, I mean, it becomes personal. There's nothing about memory that isn't, it's nothing but personal, and allows students entryways into these conversations in ways that I think can help us to feel much more empowered, much more in control, much more like we have a voice, in issues that feel daunting. And we've talked about eco anxiety and kind of climate grief on the program previously. And I mean, these are really hard things, especially for young people to deal with. And I think anything that we can do that allows them space to process that and to also not feel powerless in the face of it is really good work.
And I would just add to that that, inviting students to pull on other coursework that they're doing. We get a lot of, non-English majors taking our English classes on climate change fiction, right? And so musicians or journalists or filmmakers can bring those genres into the class and do some really, really wildly innovative projects. And I know Nick, you've done a little work with music in your dissertation. I don't know if you want to talk a bit about that, because that's a really great example of, I think, a climate change memorial anchored in music.
I'll briefly talk about it, but I composed a piece. It's called Act Like You Live Here. It's a jazz tune where every measure of the tune is a decade from the NOAA climate database of global average temperature, and the melody and the harmony is like following roughly um the the data set for every measure is a decade up to the future. And then I also try to overlay the influence of some Black jazz musicians within the 1950s and 60s in Chicago. But it was fun to like do that project. But one of the more exciting things that I wish I would have thought of, that my students did, was last semester. The University of Idaho has a phenomenal jazz school, the Lionel Hampton School of Music, and there was three students for their midterm. They composed this jazz tune, where instead of taking just a data set of the global average temperature, is they took the CO2 data from the Mauna Loa curve, of the CO2 concentration globally, and it corresponded to the tempo of the song. And by the end of the song, the piece becomes so unplayable because the tempo is so fast, which I think is a beautiful metaphor for global climate change and runaway global climate change, right? Is it becomes out of control. Um, yeah, so it's just like really cool to see. Like I've really enjoyed doing the project on my dissertation, but it's been even more exciting to see the hyper innovative ways that students will take it. And that was just like such a fun like pedagogy thing to just see unfold last semester. And I'm excited for some of those things to happen in the future, hopefully as well.
That's
That's
about the
truly
time.
amazing. Yeah, but go ahead, Weston.
That's about the time that we're at. So we will have to wrap up. But Chaney, do you want to take us out?
Sure. I mean, just thank you all for coming and talking with us about climate change memorials and for sharing all of the resources that you did, and for all the great work that y'all are doing both in your classrooms and as scholars in the broader community.
Thank you both. It's been just a delight to talk with you today.
Yeah, thanks, y'all.
Thanks so much for coming on. Now we'll go to our researcher, Sophia, who has another in her Critter Corner series.
Hi everyone, it's Sophia, and welcome back to Critter Corner, where we dive into Houston's fascinating wildlife. In each episode, we feature experts and enthusiasts who share their favorite local flora and fauna, the role in our ecosystem, and ways that we can all support our community's biodiversity. In this episode, we're joined by Carla Clay, the founding director of Artist Boat with over 30 years of experience in arts and environmental education, and who led the way to conserve over 1,000 acres on Galveston Island. Welcome to the show, Carla.
Hi, thank you, Sophie.
Of course. So to start off, can you tell me a bit about yourself and the work that you do?
I'm Carla Clay. I'm the executive director of the Artist Boat. At Artist Boat, we integrate art and science through 6 different programs to teach people about marine environments and coastal margins, from eco art kayak adventures to in-school residency programs. Everyone produces some kind of artwork to translate knowledge about the environment. They're as simple as little watercolors to like permanent murals or mosaics or trash barrels on the beach that are painted with trash messages, things like that. My work is mostly as the executive director, fundraising, grant writing, and making sure we can pay all our bills, but also that we have the staff to deliver our programs.
Well, thank you for sharing about some of the fascinating work that you do, and I'm super excited to dive in with you today. So, with that, can you tell us what species you're talking about today and why it's special to you?
My favorite animal that's not human that I've made friends with is a bottlenose dolphin. So I grew up in the Florida Keys. My dad was a shark biologist, and we had shark pens in the Gulf of Mexico, and he shipped sharks all around the world and kept them alive in captivity. And next door to us was Flipper Sea School, which is now the Dolphin Research Center. And so I've been friends with dolphins since I can remember anything. And they're very intelligent. They all have different personalities and likes and dislikes. And one dolphin, who is the star in the movie The Big Blue, Nachua, I was very close to my whole childhood. And when I was older, I went back and did a summer internship at the Dolphin Research Center, and Nachua always knew who I was, and everybody say, "Oh, Nachua has a great affinity towards you," which I already knew. But I think we learn a lot from other mammals and friendships with other species because there are languages way older than words, and those languages are intuitive to all animals. But if you wanted to know about bottlenose dolphins, I could also tell you more about them as a being, like how they work and their senses and all of that.
Yeah, I would love to hear about that. And that sounds like a really special experience that you got to share. So I'm wondering, are bottlenose dolphins at all native to Galveston Bay or other close areas of the Gulf of Mexico?
Oh, yeah. So they're a very coastal species. Most of our bays on the Gulf of Mexico have a resident population of bottlenose dolphins. We also have populations of bottlenose dolphins in the Gulf of Mexico. But for example, in Galveston Bay, I think over 3,000 individuals have been identified here after the oil spill in Barataria-Terrebonne estuary. There have been no successful live dolphin births because of all the damage done to the population from the oil spill. And people think, why don't they leave? It's polluted. But they grew up there. That's their home. And they know that the bottlenose dolphins of different bays are very faithful to those bays. So like Tampa Bay has a population. We have a population here. Down in Corpus, Aransas Pass has a population. And they live in matriarchal family groups. And the boys disperse when they get older and have to find a new family to hang out with.
What role does the bottlenose dolphin play in Galveston Bay's ecosystem, as well as the many other areas then that they can be found?
Well, the bottlenose dolphin is a top predator, so they can eat what they want. They also need a lot of food, so they probably might be perceived by fishermen to compete for food. But they're definitely a top predator, eating fish in quite an abundant amount. Of course, they're also very good for tourism because, you can sustain a dolphin watch vessel and people will pay to go see the dolphins in the ship channel or wherever. Well, they see them in the ship channel. Here is the best place to see them.
Yeah, and you've already shared a lot of interesting facts about this species, but what is one extra surprising fact about the bottlenose dolphin that you especially find interesting and that people might not know?
Oh, well, I think they're fascinating. One, they're conscious breathers. All marine mammals have to decide when to take a breath. So I always tell people, imagine if every time you just needed to breathe, you had to decide to breathe. That's a lot of attention to pay attention to yourself to breathe. So they have to be very smart. Also, with their sonar, they can send, scientists believe that they sonar something, they send out sound, they get an image back. Now, it won't be the image like we see in our eyes. And that image, they suspect that they can send it to another bottlenose dolphin. So it would be like I went to the restaurant and was like, hey, Sophie, look at my lasagna. And I sent you mentally an image of my lasagna. And then you'd be like, hey, I want to go to that restaurant. So they're conveying a lot of knowledge through their sonar to each other about the environment. And then they can stun fish with the sonar. And then also they have what's called a click train, a whistle. So they each have a name and they know each other's names and can tell each other their names.
Wow, that's super interesting. Sounds
Yeah.
like a lot of research is being done on these bottlenose dolphins.
Oh, more and more every day. Yeah.
Yeah, which is great. And with that, I'm wondering what are some simple ways that people can support the species, either through funding research or through local initiatives or anything like that?
Well, they could donate money to the marine mammals training networks in their state. Like in Texas, we have the Texas Marine Mammals Training Network. So if a dolphin is injured, they respond. If a dolphin is dead, they take a necropsy, which gives us more information about what could be happening. Anything you can do to reduce sound in the water. Sound travels 7 times faster or 3 times faster in water than air. And so like any way you can reduce sound in the ocean helps all marine mammals. Also, we have to remember every chemical that we apply to our yard, to our gardens, runs off the land during a rain event, enters the water, enters the food web. And so they're finding a lot of PCBs and other chemicals and plastics, microplastics in the dolphins, which means they're ingesting it as the food travels up the food web, it bioaccumulates in the fish that the dolphins are eating. So any reduction in pollution is paramount to the health of marine mammals. And air quality is also important because when they breathe, they are exchanging a lot more air than we do because they pull in all the air, they go underwater and they hold their breath for a long time. So I can't remember the exact amount of exchange, but Like a bird exchanges almost 100% of its air every time it breathes. A bottlenose dolphin, I don't remember the percent, but it's a lot more than we do because we can just breathe at our leisure. We don't have to think about it.
Thank you so much for sharing those tips and information about the bottlenose dolphin. I think a lot of the ways we can help are very easy and practical, but not everyone knows about them. So it's super important that you came on here and talked to us. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and for everyone listening, thanks for tuning in and make sure to come back soon to learn more about these fascinating local species.
That's our show for this week. If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email us at westont@rice.edu. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski. Co-produced by Joseph Campana. Audio engineer Rico Enriquez. Original music by Carter Dean. Research support provided by Jaden Bray Boyce, Sophia Soltez, and Amin Rinsdorf. Stay tuned for No Expectations with Marcus French here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.